first list the situations that are more challenging for you. So if it's after making a mistake, if it's before a game, after a game, did you play it bad? What is the situation? Now, after you do that, what are the evidences that makes you to think in that way with a bad approach? What are the evidences that you have for having a better approach for them, a more positive and more rational approach to it? Analyze these two things, reach a conclusion. Okay, this is the better approach based on the evidences that I have to think positively and the evidences to think negatively.
And he's here. He is here. Cristiano has entered the building. Welcome, wherever you are, to the Old Trafford Theatre.
Yes, guys, welcome back to today's episode of the Sculpted podcast. Today we have Gabriel here. Gabriel is also known as Athlete Mentality on Instagram, where I'd say most people who are familiar with his work would know him from. A bit of a funny story with myself and Gabriel. I have, when I was first starting off in my career of football, as I told him briefly before we started recording, I was one of his, I don't know, maybe, I think when he first released his ebook, I was the winner to his competition. So it's quite cool for me to, a few years later, talk with him again and talk about, the mental side of the game for our listeners today. So it's going to be a great episode, and we're going to be talking about setbacks and the perception of setbacks, basically, because as Val loves to talk about falling forwards, it's a really important thing for anyone in life to actually kind of flip the switch on framing setbacks to something where you can use it as an opportunity to fall forwards, like Val said there, and how we'll talk about today. But that being said, we will go on to Gabe and get a bit of a background on him, and then we'll get into the episode.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a very, as I told you, a small world. What a coincidence to, a few years later, be here recording a podcast. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And just a small introduction, I'm not going to take much time to do that, but I work with athletes, helping them to work on their mental side, to improve confidence, motivation, focus. I was an athlete myself before. That's what made me to get started in this field. I started to study those things for myself to help me perform better. You work it. I was so passionate about it that I decided to work more on it when my career was not going the way I wanted. I was not enjoying that as much. I was getting a lot of injuries, so I decided to start working on this. Fast forward a couple years, that's what I'm doing today, helping athletes to overcome the things that I struggled when I was an athlete. And my goal today is to help you with that as well, to help you understand how you can build more resilience, to fail in a good way that you can learn and grow from it. Hopefully we'll be able to take some good ideas and some tools from here today.
Yeah, excellent. So, guys, as Gabe's just said there, with even his career as a player, I remember, so just so our listeners know, you've been living in Brazil, correct? And you obviously, Brazil is football fanatics, and it's a lifestyle there. So, it's a great perspective for us to even just hear about someone who's living on, I wouldn't say the other side of the world, because that's kind of my end of the world in Australia, but in another part of the world where I'd say a lot of people don't necessarily know, well, obviously they know about, but they don't necessarily hear too many perspectives of, because obviously the language barrier. But Gabe's got pretty good English, so it's even great to just hear his perspective on things and talking about personal anecdotes, because there are many top footballers from that part of the world, but we don't really get an insight to them like we do with the English-speaking players. And especially, for instance, with basketballers, I think you get much more of an insight to their lives than you do for footballers, because of sometimes in America, it's a more media-driven society compared to football and the professionalism aspect. But just hearing from a different person, different part of the world, will be a great insight for all of our listeners. That being said, I think if we start up the first kind of topic and talking about setbacks in life, setbacks in football, we have obviously personal anecdotes as athletes ourselves. I think that where we kind of want to take this today is talking about, I think maybe even if we just go off personal anecdotes first, just to get the topic started. So, I guess I can talk about for myself, a setback. Typically, we would say for footballers, the major setbacks for our career is in injuries, or getting released by a club. Something that I have more experience in is the second option, unfortunately. Maybe actually that's better because injuries are more career-ending. But I've been released by more clubs than I've had injuries, I'd say. But for me, I think that getting released by a club, for a lot of people, they might see this as a setback, and they might take this completely personally. They might take it as a full stop to their career, to their ambition, to their goals, things like this. But what we kind of want to talk about in this episode is making this as, it could be a time to reset, it could be a time to reflect, to plan, to create a path where you're going to take steps to a future endeavor, whether it's in the field of football, other places. But if we can talk about, let's say, for players who are dealing with a setback of, let's say, feedback. Let's not even say players, actually. Let's just say people in general who are dealing with a perceived setback of feedback and something that is a direct criticism of their craft. How would someone deal with this? And how would someone build the grit and determination to, move on and take the steps forwards in their life?
Okay. I think before moving into the practical side and more application side, there's one research that I love it, and it fits exactly into what we're talking about. In 2008, there was one research that a psychologist did with Olympic swimmers. Actually, they were trying to qualify for the Olympic Games. And the ones that didn't qualify, they got this group of swimmers, took them to a room, and showed them their bad performances that eventually was the reason why they didn't qualify for the Olympic Games. So they were watching these performances that they felt, and they were recording their brain activities while watching that. And the conclusion, the result of that was those athletes, those swimmers, were looking at their failures, and the part of their brain responsible for detecting threats, which is the amygdala, became more active. With that, we're less able to perceive or to make conclusions out of what's happening, or more rational conclusions of what's happening. So for any athlete or person, when you are facing a setback and you are seeing that as a threat, biologically, when your brain activates this part that is responsible for detecting threats, you are going to feel bad, you're going to have negative emotions, you're going to feel anger, frustration, anxiety. All of that will come because that's your brain at work. That's what's happening. That's the perception you have about that situation. So they took all of these athletes, took them to a mental training program, they call in the research a cognitive intervention, and then went back to the same room, watched the same performance, and recording their brain activity again. In the second attempt, their brain activity was completely different. The amygdala, as I was saying, the part of the brain responsible for detecting threats, was less active, and the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of the brain that is responsible for making more rational analysis, more rational decisions, became more active. So to put that in a more simple way, for any person that you want to overcome setbacks in a way that you can learn and grow from them, you have to be more rational by activating more the prefrontal cortex than the amygdala. So how do we do that? Now we move on to the more practical part of that. How can we make more sense of those situations, of understanding things in a way that we can actually grow from the mistakes and failures that we have? So the best way to do that is by preparing before it happens. So for example, myself as an athlete, the personal experiences that I had when I was 15, 16 years old, I was so afraid to fail, I was so afraid to make mistakes in a game that whenever that happened, it was just impossible for me to make sense of that and be calm at that point, because my perception, the conclusion that I had about that situation was, this is very bad. This is an awful thing that happened to me, and now others will think that I'm not good enough. I think that I'm not good enough. Now I'm not able to perform because I just made an awful thing. Instead of just approaching the game and trying to, for example, use some sort of self-affirmation at that time, mistakes are fine, they're part of the process. At that time, it's not going to work, because imagine that I have been practicing a specific reaction to that situation for hundreds of games in my career. And at that point, when that happens, my reaction to it is automatic. My emotional response is, this is awful. So instead of just leaving for that moment, it's a long-term process. Eventually, every day, consistently, I would have to, okay, what are mistakes? What do they mean? How can I approach them in a way that it can grow? What is the perception, or what is the conclusion of all mistakes that is more aligned with my goals? Which is the approach that is going to give me more chances of achieving my goals, and trying to make sense of that. When I'm under pressure, in a moment of crisis, we panic. It's impossible to make conclusions at that point, so we have to prepare for it. And these daily analysis with a daily mental preparation that could include several drills, visualization, mindfulness, self-talk, journaling, all of that would help tremendously to start shaping this new perception and approach about mistakes, about failures, or any situation that triggers negative emotions. It would be a very similar process of trying to understand it. What is my current approach, my current beliefs about that situation, practicing daily a new approach until the point that it becomes easier. When I face that situation, I'm able to recall all of that training that I was doing. Okay, at this point, the best approach to it is, it's fine, mistakes are part of the process, but I reinforce that so much when I'm able to do it. It's just like the physical training. If I have been practicing long balls for the past 2-3 months, whenever I get to the game and I have to take that action, it's gonna flow more naturally. I will be able to do it. But if I'm not practicing that, and when a situation comes, I'm not ready for it, I'll have those skills, the chances of making a mistake or not being able to perform the way I wanted to perform are much higher.
Yeah, I really like the first example that you gave. That really proves the point that the perception of the, let's say, setback is actually a massive determinant of the end result, I guess. Because let's say what we've previously spoken about with a few other guests has been this voice that you naturally have as a human being that keeps you safe, right? It's a survival mechanism that we all have. And this voice is not necessarily relevant in today's society, as we don't necessarily have those threats that are life-ending as they used to in the past. But these survival instincts, they still kick in today. And we aren't necessarily wired for performance or these modern, phenomenons of playing in front of thousands of people. I mean, this is completely unheard of for people thousands of years ago, but today this is what our reality is. And these survival instincts aren't necessarily, yes, they're here to serve us because they're keeping us safe, but they also hinder us in other ways for performance, for example. So we really do have to rewire these survival mechanisms to thrive in today's society, in, let's say, sports, business, in all the areas where you want to become the best. You really do have to rewire your brain. And I think that it's definitely not an easy thing for people to understand and to necessarily do. But you mentioned a lot about the prefrontal cortex and I can't even pronounce the other word, but that's the one. But these are things that people actually need to take time to I'd say research, because there's a lot of power in knowing just what you're capable as a human being, realizing that a lot of the thoughts that you have aren't there to serve you in the way that you might think, if that makes sense. So if I'm thinking, for an example, for me, if I'm thinking, okay, I'm taking a goal kick, and in the back of my head I'm hearing, oh, plant your foot here, because if you don't, you're gonna scuff it. Okay, that thought, if I'm thinking about it, it's there to keep me safe, because I don't want to scuff it, so I'm gonna plant my foot here. But the more I think about planting my foot here and scuffing the ball, the more likely it's gonna happen. And that can be very, very transmissible to the setback thing. So if I'm thinking, okay, this setback is going to ruin my career, let's say, and all I'm focusing on is this setback is against me. Everything is against me. It's almost the victim mentality that this is not serving me. It's only going to hinder me. This is something that doesn't serve you as an individual, but taking the necessary steps to reprogram your brain, to reframe this setback as something where you can reset, you can move forwards from it. It may be one door closing, but another door opening. There are many different ways to, analyze the perceived setback, to use it as something where you can actually fall forwards. And that being said, I just want to quickly go into Val and see if he's got any specific anecdotes that he can give to the topic about falling forwards rather than perceiving the setback as a negative.
Yes. So basically, I had a lot of setbacks in my career already. I think if I give you a small, briefer history, in the last 3 years, I could only play roughly 10 games plus or minus because of injuries. Some on the other spectrum area, like Nick. Nick has moved a lot of times, had multiple clubs. I've been loyal to one club only until me signing my first professional contract in Greece. But in the last 3 years, I've honestly could only make roughly 10 games because in my under 17 year, I've had an injury over the whole season. Throughout, I had multiple injuries, different surgeries whatsoever. But I think those times, those injuries set me forward. They fell forward for myself. It determined who I am today. And I'm really happy that I went through these moments because those shaped my character and who I am today. And going back to what Gabriel said at the beginning, looking the fear or your setbacks into the eyes directly. For example, acknowledging what can happen in the game, realizing that we will make mistakes, realizing that mistakes would happen. And for example, going back to the analogy of falling forward, if we are already on the ground, we can't fall much further down than the ground because we are already at the lowest level. In that terms, lower the bar for yourself. Don't expect the highest output every single day. Start off building your momentum up again, lowering the bar for yourself. In a practical example, in a game, you had 5-10 minutes which went bad for you in the first couple of minutes of the game. Lower the bar. Talk to yourself. For the next 5 passes, play it simple. Get your confidence back. That's my point of view on it, trying to get back onto the setbacks, trying to change the mindset. Because once you start thinking about the setbacks too much, them impacting you, because each human or all of us roughly thinks 60,000 thoughts a day. 95% of those thoughts are reoccurring.